here? Good. I'm used to lecturing to my students in halls bigger than this, so I don't usually use one of these. You know, more years ago than I care to remember, I think my last comment was 47, when I was a literature major in college back at Penn State in Pennsylvania. Well, sometime when I was about a junior, I think, 1968 this would have been. A friend and I were talking about what we would do with our lives and careers, and at that time I thought mine would be an academic life, and I said, well, what you want to do is learn as much as possible about as many things as possible, and so forth. You want to become a really, really knowledgeable, wide-read generalist. And my buddy said, no, what you really want to do is pick out a figure and become a specialist on it. Well, 47 years later, who was talking to you but our Peckinpah? Because in 1969 I saw The Wild Bunch, and I felt what Emily Dickinson said, you know, you're in the presence of poetry when you feel the top of your head coming off. And I knew then and there that I wanted to write about this filmmaker. I've been writing about films for reviewing films and that sort of thing. But at that, I mean, this work I felt was so extraordinary that I felt I needed a better education than I had at the time to do the kind of job on his films that I wanted to do. And so I eventually got a doctorate from the University of Iowa and my first job at USC, University of Southern California, where, not coincidentally, Peckinpah himself had graduated with a master's degree in theater in 1954. Well, I soon discovered that I really didn't want the career that went along with the degree. I mean, even though I'm an academic again, because for the last 10 years I've been teaching, as Thomas told you, advanced editing in Chapman University's film school, but throughout all of that time I have maintained a full-time career as a film editor. But as a consequence of meeting Peckinpah and some of his editors, and I particularly wanted to meet his editors because Peckinpah has had such difficulty getting his films to market in versions that he wanted. He was always fighting with the front office, always fighting with the money men, and I wanted to find out more about that. Well, I had a chance to jump ship in 1982 when I became an assistant editor on a film by Roger Spotswood called Under Fire, and I kind of haven't looked back since. But by then, I had already published my critical study of Peckinpah's Western films. A second edition came out in 1997, which was when I happened to be nominated for the documentary I made on The Wild Bunch. Of all of Peckinpah's films, Pat Garrett and Billy the Kid was the most difficult in terms of coming up with a version that anybody, the director himself, could agree is the version of the film that I want you to see. This is because it was never finished. He left, and it's a complicated story, which is why I wound up writing a whole book about it. He left on his own volition because he simply refused to do any more work on it. The word went out that the studio took it away from him and butchered it. That's not true either. The theatrical version was in fact prepared by his editors with whom he had been working on the last 3 to 5 films. Nevertheless, there was not a version of this film that was ever released that was agreed upon, and there were 5 of them, you could imagine, counting one that I did, which is where my story here begins. 10 years ago, if you had told me that I would be writing a book about Pat Garrett and Billy the Kid, and also about Pat Garrett and Billy the Kid, I would have looked at you as if you were crazy. The way this happened was that in 2005, Warner Brothers, through the aegis of one of their executives who was devoted to Peckinpah and a good friend of mine who was the producer of my documentary, wanted to put out a complete edition of all of the Peckinpah Westerns that the studio owned. Well, they didn't technically own Pat Garrett and Billy the Kid because it was an MGM production, but MGM sold its library to Turner. Turner has a release deal with Warner Brothers, so you can see how complicated this came to be. And in the second edition of my book, when the preview cuts, the longer preview cuts of Pat Garrett and Billy the Kid were made available, one of them was made available, I ventured the opinion that I thought that the theatrical version was in fact better edited. It was a more finished film because it was literally a more finished film. The preview versions were never properly finished, but they had several scenes in it that Peckinpah did want in the movie. So in the second edition of my book, I ventured the opinion that I think you would come closest to an ideal version of this film if you could simply take several of the scenes that were cut, that were cut from the release version and put them back into the release version. In other words, you use that as the base version, not the rougher cut preview version. And so Nick Redman says they want to do this at Warner Brothers and they want you to do this. So naively, I accepted. One of the reasons, by the way, I should say, by the way, I'd like to say that, you know, I'm happy to have anybody ask me questions while I'm going along. I mean, this is fairly casual, so if there's questions you ask while I'm going along, please feel free to ask them. In any case, where was I? So I thought that one of the reasons why I framed the thing this way is that the theatrical version, despite its undeserved reputation as being butchered, was in fact not prepared by the studio at all. It was merely insisted upon by the studio. They wanted a version of about 100 minutes length. It wound up being about 106 minutes, as opposed to the 2 hours and 2 minutes, 2 hours and 4 minutes that the preview versions were. But it was actually prepared by Peckinpah's editors and Dan Melnick, who, though he worked for the studio, was in fact quite devoted to the film and wanted to bring out the best version possible. So it was a version that was actually fine cut. And as I say, one of the reasons why I wanted to use that as the base version is that I wanted to do as little editing as I possibly could on this film. I profoundly admired the work of the editors who did it, and I didn't think it was my business to go in there and second guess them and Peckinpah. I knew which scenes he wanted in the film, and so I restored those to the film. And the long and the short of it is, we thought everybody would be thrilled by this. And in fact, a great many people were thrilled by this, except that in this day and age, we live in the age of the internet. And the internet gives everybody with time on his or her hands a computer a chance to declare himself an expert, a guru, no matter what he wants. So there was a small but very noisy contingent of the editor of the internet that was outraged because the version did not look like the preview versions. I don't want to get into detail about the differences between the two. I don't think they're that consequential, except that I think it goes to the favor of the theatrical. And particularly given my reputation as a Peckinpah critic and scholar, several were just disappointed or outraged that I could have lent myself to this project. And I was vilified. Well, after a while, you just get tired of reading about this kind of stuff, and I had other work to do, so I just, and my Nick Redman said, just Paul, don't even bother with it. Nick does a lot of restorations. He says you get this stuff all the time. So I let it go at that. About 4 years later, a friend of mine, who's also a distinguished Peckinpah scholar and written a couple of books, was putting together an anthology of new essays on Peckinpah's films. They had to be newly composed. And I'm always asked to contribute to one of these. Well, I was busy at the time. I didn't want to do it. I write about Peckinpah again. I just, and so there it went for about a year, and Michael Bliss, who's the editor of Anthology, kept pestering me. And so finally, I guess I read something on the internet about what I supposedly did with Pat Garrett and Billy the Kid. And I thought, enough is enough. Maybe that was just the straw that broke this camel's back. So I said to Michael, I'll tell you what I'll do. I'll write about the preparation, how I came to do the special edition of Pat Garrett and Billy the Kid. And I did. And it turned out to be a 26,000-word essay. That, when the book came out, was widely regarded as the best essay in the book. And I mean, it was very, very well received. Well, one night at dinner, about the time I was done with the essay and so on, I said to my wife, after what it surely must have been at least one martini, you know, this might be the beginning of a small book. Well, be careful what you say, because 150,000 additional words and 5 years later, this was the book. So that's how I got to it. That's how I came to write it. Most people, when they hear about the book or see it, the first thing they ask about is the title. That's an awfully long title, isn't it, Paul? Now, some people, how many people in here know something about Pat Garrett and Billy the Kid? So most of you can pick up the allusion to the title. Do you not? Is there anybody who doesn't understand the title, The Authentic Death and Contentious Afterlife of Pat Garrett and Billy the Kid, the untold story of Peckinpah's last Western film? Well, all of you, of course, know that the title of Garrett's book is The Authentic Life of Billy the Kid. Where does Authentic Death come from? Well, Authentic Death comes from a novel that Charles Seydor wrote, a really good one, based on the Pat Garrett and Billy the Kid legend, called The Authentic Death of Henry Jones. So he's already alluding to Garrett's title, so I get to do a double allusion on the thing. Plus, it just tickled me to have a title that harks back to the old-fashioned, to those old-fashioned titles. I mean, how many of you think you know that? Can any of you tell me what the title of Garrett's book is? Anybody here? Can anybody just give me the title of it? The Authentic Life of Billy the Kid? No. Here is the title. The Authentic Life of Billy the Kid, the noted desperado of the Southwest, whose deeds of daring and blood made his name a terror in New Mexico, Arizona, and northern Mexico. By Pat F. Garrett, Sheriff of Lincoln Co., NM, by whom he was finally hunted down and captured by killing him. A faithful and interesting narrative. I mean, there's the quote in the book. That's how much space it takes just to give the entire title of the book. So I really thought it would be fun to evoke this whole sense of just home. Plus I love literary allusions, so there's all of that. And then when I talked to Northwestern, I mean, I think they did a smashing job of designing the book, because I said, I think it might be fun to evoke the old-fashioned Western novels or Western histories where they had a mix of fonts and all this. And the only thing I said was I wanted these three pictures on the cover of the book, which is Peckinpah, James Coburn, his Garrett, and Chris Christopherson, his Billy the Kid, because that's part of the theme of the Peckinpah portion of the book. So I decide I'm going to write a book about this. So then what do I do next? Okay, that's easy to say. So I thought, well, since you talked about how it came out, why not talk about where it came from? So if you start going backward from the movie, where's the first place a movie comes from? Well, it comes from the screenplay. Okay, except that this screenplay, which was an original screenplay by Rudolph Wurlitzer, once Peckinpah became involved, that then leads us to another screenplay, which was written 15 years earlier by none other than Sam Peckinpah himself, called The Authentic Death of Henry Jones, because Peckinpah was brought in to adapt Charles Seydor's novel, The Authentic Death of Henry Jones, to the screen. The novel was published in 1956. There was Marlon Brando wanted to make a movie. He wanted to be in a Western. Presumably Rod Steiger did the first screenplay, but I have never been able to find Rod Steiger's screenplay, if it exists. My own, it's not in any of the places that have his collected work, so my own supposition is his screenplay probably was just a treatment. In movie parlance, that's about a 30 to 50 page long description of the movie, okay? Because I can't find, there's no screenplay, and I think it would have to have been kept somewhere. But in any event, they hired Peckinpah to do it, and his screenplay does exist. It's the second screenplay he ever wrote. Okay, so now we have two prior works. We have Wurlitzer's original screenplay, then we have Peckinpah's screenplay, which he said to Wurlitzer, take a look at it. He said, if there's anything you can use in there, use it. All right, eventually, a good bit of what Sam wrote wound up being used in that. But what happens then when you get those two things, then you get a third book, which is Nider's novel. And once you're talking about Nider's novel, where does that take you? Well, that takes you all the way back to Pat Garrett and the authentic life of Billy the Kid. So one of the things I discovered is, the first thing I discovered, I mean, this fell into place in about, I kid you not, half an hour once I thought, and I had the whole first part of the book. I had the whole first part of the book because it goes from, first of all, Peckinpah's changes on Wurlitzer's screenplay, that's the end of part one. Wurlitzer's screenplay, that's the next one. Peckinpah's adaptation, that's the next one. Then Nider's novel. Then we have Garrett's book. Only one problem with that. Let me see. This is a book about Sam Peckinpah and Pat Garrett and Billy the Kid. And suddenly I'm beginning with Pat Garrett and Billy the Kid. I'm not beginning with Peckinpah. So I go back to my original article and I see, aha, there's the solution right there. The beginning of the original essay was, I'm talking about One-Eyed Jacks. Because that is the movie that Peckinpah's screenplay almost unrecognizably changed became. So I began the book with Brando's Western, because that gives me a chance to begin with Peckinpah and then move back into Pat Garrett and Billy the Kid. Now, since this is a sort of historical, I'm supposed to have kind of a historical bias here, this is what I want to get into next for the remainder of the talk, because I had been a critic before this, a critic and a scholar, okay, and that's a certain kind of history, but it's not ordinarily what we think of as history, even though a lot of research is involved in it, okay. So when I got to the Garrett part of it, I mean, the first thing I realized is that the kind of book I'm writing, I'm not going to go back into all the original sources. I'm not going to go back into all the newspaper sources and all the rest of it. First of all, that wasn't the kind of book I was writing. My primary materials were the ones I've just described, these books and so forth. But inevitably, you have to get into some extent the story of the history of Pat Garrett and Billy the Kid. And this got to be fascinating to me because the first thing I discovered is, as I say at the beginning of the book, for whatever reason, this is like a Bermuda's Triangle for people who start to read about it. I mean, decades ago, Frederick Nolan, an Englishman, wrote a book about another Englishman, John Tunstall, an employer of Billy the Kid, who was killed. He wandered into this, and he still hasn't wandered out of it. I mean, Nolan has read he's written many other things, but he is still writing about Pat Garrett and Billy the Kid. And it does become endlessly fascinating. One of the reasons it becomes endlessly fascinating is that there is so little known for certain. For example, right here in Santa Fe, is it the First Presbyterian Church? What is the Presbyterian Church up here? Is it the First Presbyterian Church? Way back in 1873, at a wedding that was performed there, if some record keeper or functionary at the church had not had the presence of mind to write that Catherine McCarty was married today to William Henry Harrison Antrim, and the wedding was attended to, witnessed by her sons, Henry and Joseph. Henry was Billy because he was called Billy, or he was called Henry, he wasn't called Billy at that time, and his mother continued to call him Henry after she married Antrim so that they wouldn't be confused. But do you realize that that is the first instance of public record that establishes the existence of Billy the Kid? Prior to that, there is no record. If you talk about his official record, there is no record of the existence of Billy the Kid prior to that entry in the church right over here. Now, this is kind of fascinating, of course. And then, I mean, there's endless speculation about. Probably he did grow up in New York, but then other people say Coffeyville, Kansas, and other people. I mean, there's, and Billy himself was inconsistent about it because sometimes he would say one and sometimes he would say the other. Okay, so one of the things I began to get interested in, and I did in the second chapter of the book, which is called Garrett's Narrative, is I went through all of the standard biographies and writings about Pat Garrett and Billy the Kid, and I was really fascinated by the divergent points of view. For example, Billy was a great kid, orphaned early. You know, he fell into a life of crime. It wasn't his own fault. If he had just had better influences, etc., and so forth. On the other hand, he was a reprobate from the beginning. He was pure, unadulterated evil. He killed killed somebody for every day of his, or every year of his life. His 21 years. Maybe he lived 21 years. Maybe he lived 25. Maybe he lived only 18. God only knows. I mean, his birth date of 1859, November, I forget the exact date, but the date happens to be suspiciously identical to the date of Ash Upson, who was Garrett's ghostwriter. So here's the other thing. This is what else gets interesting about Pat Garrett and Billy the Kid, the history of it, because the one history we have as a participant is Garrett's, except that Garrett's book was ghostwritten by Ash Upson. Now, nobody in his right mind could read the first 2/3 of this book and think he's reading history. I mean, it's just ridiculous. But it was the sort of thing that sold really well back east. And this was the market that Upson was. There was a voracious market back east for stories about the Old West, particularly if they could be passed off as real. Hence, that's why authentic, faithful, true, etc. This is why all these adjectives are always loaded into these narratives. I mean, I can't imagine the readers believed it anyway, but you went along for the ride because it was a pretty good ride. The trouble with Garrett's book is, however, what gets tricky about it is Garrett himself does not enter as participant until the final third of the book. And then it gets more interesting. The outlandish, the overwrought style settles down. It seems a bit more like dictation. Everything seems a whole lot more plausible. And so by the time we get to Billy's last night and the fated encounter in Pete Maxwell's bedroom in Fort Sumner, most people are inclined to give Garrett's account a lot of credence. Among other things, his deputy wrote an account many years later, a few decades later, and for the most part they jive. All right. Now, the fascinating thing here is that among the things I discovered researching the history, and this is parallel to a lot of the criticism that goes on of the movie, is that I find after a while writers want to take sides. Okay? They either want to take sides with Billy or they want to take sides with Garrett. And there are several studies of this. I mean, if you follow the cycles throughout the subsequent history of Pat Garrett and Billy the Kid as myth and legend, you will find that these views often correspond with what is going on in society. You know, in the earlier times, you know, with when everybody was very concerned about law and order and taming the West, Billy was viewed relatively unsympathetically. Garrett was viewed sympathetically. Okay, during the Depression years, Billy came to be a much more sympathetic character, and Garrett himself a much less sympathetic one. And so it goes throughout. And the interesting thing is, you can find the seeds for this in Garrett's own book, in the Garrett Upson own book. I mean, they in fact define the continuum from unregenerate, natural-born outlaw to misunderstood victim of society and so on. And you can just, you can run the gamut. And everybody who writes about Pat Garrett and Billy the Kid since then seems to take a position along the continuum. Okay, so that's one of the interesting things I found out just in investigating this, because I began to, I began to be interested in the processes of writing history. For example, how do you begin to write something? I mean, how do you begin to write history? You know, we like to think that, you know, we have trained historians, they view the facts objectively, they do the research exhaustively, they try to reconstruct a history that is a plausible instance of what happens, except that so much of the time, you're dealing with assumptions that you may not even realize you have. And there was one particular thing in the Pat Garrett and Billy the Kid story that I got to be very fascinated with, and I can't claim exhaustively to have researched and read every last thing on Pat Garrett and Billy the Kid, because, as Larry McMurtry once said, Larry McMurtry quoted a noted bibliographer friend of his who said that the only bibliographies he was aware of that were longer than Billy the Kid's were Jesus Christ and Napoleon's. I would think that Shakespeare surely was, but in any event, this is what this bibliographer told Larry McMurtry, so I was not going to plow through all of this. However, one thing that just got to be interesting to me, because it's a big issue in Peckinpah's film, and that is, once Billy the Kid killed Ollinger and Bell in his famous escape, a little under 3 months before he himself was killed, why didn't he go to Mexico? That would seem the logical thing to do. Why didn't he get the hell out of the territory and go to Mexico? Or California? Now, most of the historians that I have read have tried to answer that question. And of course, the big answer most of them come up with is Walter Burns' answer, who wrote a wonderful pot-boiling book called The Saga of Billy the Kid, which was based on numerous interviews with a lot of the people who were still alive at the time, and so forth. But Burns' answer is he was in love with Polita Maxwell. I see everybody shaking their heads. Yes, he was in love with Polita Maxwell, and that's why he didn't go. Okay? And, you know, I got to thinking about this just for the longest time, and I thought to myself, well, you know, here's a guy who, from all reports, he was a real ladies' man. I mean, we have only the one picture of him which Paulita indignantly said did him no justice. He didn't really dress like that. He dressed really nicely around town and so forth. But the thing is, ladies found him very handsome. He was a superb dancer. He went to all the dances. And he is said to have had a lady and more in practically every village, settlement, crossroads in the area. And he is, what, 18, 19, 20, 21. 2021 at this time. I'm thinking to myself back at this time, you know, wow, I've got all this, and I'm really going to be playing. A lot of this just doesn't compute. Plus, he loves to gamble. He loves that. He is, for all we can tell, living perfectly happy, living a carefree life, robbing. He actually didn't rob. Billy was not a bandit. So far as we were able to tell, Billy didn't rob stagecoaches and that kind of stuff. There's some evidence to suggest he might have been tangentially involved in a counterfeit ring, but that's all very vague. The reality is he wasn't a bandit. He didn't go stick up banks and that kind of thing. He rustled. And he also stole horses, which takes my breath away. Because, you know, as a buddy of mine from Texas said, you know, if you did this in Texas, you were hanged for stealing one. He stole several horses and was caught and was never hanged. Right? I just gave it back to him, they tossed him into jail or whatever. He was extremely adept at busting out of jails. He did it all the time and so forth. So one of the things I'm trying to get at is, it's not to suggest that maybe Polito wasn't the reason. What I'm trying to suggest is, if you ask the question, why didn't he go to Mexico? That is predicated on the assumption that it occurred to him to go to Mexico. And therefore, we have to find the reasons why he didn't go to Mexico. So, Mark Lee Gardner, at least, the Billy the Kid historian whom I admire most, the one original contribution that my book may make to this whole issue is that I simply said, what if we ask a different question all along? What if the question were not, why did he go to Mexico, but would it ever have occurred to him to go to Mexico as a serious option? You know, he had friends around the area. I mean, all of his friends were around the area. He had families, particularly Hispanic families, who really liked him. He was welcome in all those places, particularly Fort Sumner. He loved to gamble. He loved to dance. He had girlfriends. He had women everywhere, and so forth. And as far as he could tell, no doubt, starting to believe his own legend, what jail could hold him? I mean, he'd been busting out of jail since he was 15 years old. In any event, this is not to suggest that everybody else is wrong and I am right. Not at all. But it is to suggest that this is yet more things that we don't know about Billy the Kid. And if you ask certain kinds of questions, they are going to, by definition, lead you to certain kinds of answers. And if you ask other questions, you will at least be forced into other, into other possible explanations. And certainly, if we are to read, say, the testimony or the books by close friends like Frank Coe in Frontier Fighter, for instance, in Frontier Fighter, when they all, after the Lincoln County Wars, which were in their own small way quite bloody, they were all ready to get the hell out of the territory, and they did. The Coes cleared out of New Mexico, and some of the others went to Fort Sumner, and then eventually they left in the area. Only a relative few, and Billy the Kid was one of them, stuck around, and he said, I need money. Nobody's going to push me out of the territory. If I get caught again, I'm not going to be taken alive. I mean, so far as I can tell, any of the direct evidence we have about Billy says that the reason he hung around were these reasons. All right, so again, not to suggest one or the other is right, but I have a feeling this also may, precisely because there is so little that can be said with certainty about Pat Garrett and Billy the Kid, it has just led to all of this immense speculation, which, by the way, shows almost no signs of abating, and some of the theories get nuttier and nuttier as they go. I'm not going to go into the whole thing about Pete Maxwell, Polito's father, actually conspired to lure Billy into a trap by using his daughter as a bait, and so on, because he wanted to split up the romance between Billy and Polito. Yes?
In Billy's mind, what would have been his sense of the vigor with which Governor Wallace and Pat Garrett, the powers that be here in Santa Fe, were going to go after him?
Well, one of my answers to that would be, particularly if you read Eve Ball's book on Mam Jones, I would maintain that I don't think Billy actually had a real clear idea of the kind of man that Garrett was. I mean, Garrett said, or what's his name? Walter Burns described him as a kind of machine, that when he decided to get a man, he went after him and he didn't stop until he got him. I don't know that that's exactly true, because among other things, once Billy escaped from Fort Sumner, the trail dried up really fast. You know, one of the liberties that Peckinpah and Wurlitzer took in their movie is they have Pat Garrett going on a sustained manhunt to get Pat Garrett and Billy the Kid. Now, they're right to get Billy. Now, they're right to do that because part of the theme of Peckinpah's movie is that Garrett wants Billy to leave because he doesn't want to kill him. And so what he does is he goes on this elaborate circular manhunt and does a whole bunch of things, some of them pretty nefarious, some of them pretty terrible things, but they're all done to get Billy to realize, I'm coming after you. If you make me do it, I'm going to kill you. And, what's his name? John Wilson said the same thing. You know, he said Pat Garrett, he even told a story about Pat Garrett and Billy, and Garrett saying to some of Billy and some of his friends, you know, if you guys don't get out of here, I'm going to kill you, you're going to kill me. Why don't you just get out of here, go away for 3 or 4 years, and come back and it'll all blow away, which is, by the way, is exactly what happened with the Coe cousins. They did come back 3 or 4 years later, and it was all blown away, and they lived to ripe old ages. So I'm not sure, I have not been completely convinced that there was all that much concerted an effort to get Billy the Kid as some of the literature. I mean, literature makes it. I mean, Wallace put out an award, but then he buggered off because he couldn't wait to get out of New Mexico anyway because Ben-Hur was a big hit, his novel and all that. So he got the hell out of there. And Garrett stopped looking for him. And the reason why Garrett stopped looking for him is, as I say, the trail dried up. And in fact, I mean, I bring this up in the book, but you'll find it in a lot of history books. The people around Lincoln and so forth were getting pretty upset with Garrett. I mean, we elected you as the law and order man. What are you doing? And you're sitting on your bike. You know, why haven't you gone? Well, he didn't go out and catch him because he didn't know where he was. So Garrett wasn't even. Now, Garrett himself says, look, I was just lying low. And he might have been. I mean, we do know that Garrett was a pretty diligent lawman when he wanted to be a pretty diligent lawman. And I mean, for example, the murders, you know, in Dog Canyon of Fountain and Boyd suggest how much Garrett, when he was on the trail of something and wanted to catch somebody, I mean, he was unsuccessful, but he worked very hard at it. So it's hard for me to imagine that Billy wouldn't have even been aware of those rumors that say, well, Garrett's just given up. I mean, what do you have to worry about? I mean, just, yeah, hang around down here. I mean, and he hung around. There were various towns, not just in Fort Sumner, but a lot of the sheep herders camps and the Mexican sheep herders camps and so forth. He went to places like that. I mean, this is strictly my opinion. All right, this is not presented as. My opinion is that he figured he had pretty much gotten away. And he was basically kind of doing as all right as he always did. When I need money, I'll go steal something to get the money for it. So anyhow, so that's yet another part of the history that, again, I'm fascinated by. And part of what I did in the book is just trying to present these various versions. I don't know where we are in time because I want to leave some time open for, yes?
Is there any chance there was ever offspring from Billy the Kid?
Well, yes, as a matter of fact. I've heard from Mark Lee Gardner has letters. He's talked with people in the area. There are at least three women with whom he is said to have begotten children. There were rumors that Polita Maxwell was one of them, which is just nonsense. I mean, if Polita did, then if she were pregnant by Billy, she either had to have had an abortion, had to have had a miscarriage, or somebody sent her off, and she had a kid somewhere and left him there, because she married not long after Billy was killed, and the only daughters came way too late. So that couldn't be. But yes, there are. Who was it? Was it Walter Byrne or who wrote Mark? Mark sent me a letter. It's in the book in which he said he named three people, and in fact the kids who were widely believed in the territory, widely believed around Lincoln, Fort Sumner, etc., to have been Billy the Kid's progeny. Yes.
I have a question that's more to do with the history of the movie
Yeah.
than the history of the
Fine,
history.
that's great.
So how did Bob Dylan get involved in this whole thing?
Well, Wurlitzer knew Dylan, and he said, you know, I'm doing a movie with Pat Garrett about Pat Garrett and Billy the Kid, and Sam Peckinpah's directing, and of course everybody was overjoyed with Peckinpah. I mean, suddenly I mean, he was the greatest director of Westerns since John Ford. And in the heretical opinion of some of us, his best work is better than Ford's, but let that pass. It certainly is good. Let's put it, it certainly is great. And as I understand it, you know, he said, well, you know, I'd kind of like to be, maybe I'd like to be a part of this. And amazingly, he'd never seen The Wild Bunch. So Gordon Carroll arranged a screening of The Wild Bunch for Dylan in New York, at least as Gordon told me, the producer. Dylan was planning on watching 20 minutes or something like that. Well, to Dylan's everlasting credit, like practically anybody else who's ever sat down and tried to watch a Peckinpah movie for only 20 minutes, he came out 2.5 hours later, I mean, really visibly shaken, and just said, yeah, I want to be a part of this. So, of course, the first thing that Peckinpah does when Dylan's introduced to him is says, I'm a big fan of Roger Miller myself. But that's the sort of thing. Anyway, that's how he became involved. The character of Alias, as you may know, I was about to say it has a historical basis. It has no historical basis. The only reason it has a historical basis is that Ash Upson introduced him in the first part of the Ghost Written Book. And he said, yeah, Billy had a friend who changed his name so many times that Billy couldn't remember him, so he just called him Alias, and so forth. But Peckinpah always conceived, I mean, Dylan was upset that he didn't have more lines. But in fact, it's easy to sort of see what Sam was doing. I mean, the first thing you do when you have Bob Dylan in the movies, what the hell are you going to do with Bob Dylan in the movies? First thing is, oh, there's Bob Dylan. So you can only work with that. So if you'll recall in the movie, Dylan is introduced working in a newspaper office. He's a printer. And after the escape, of course, he gives up his job and throws it away and comes out and joins Billy's gang. So obviously Peckinpah means for him to be a kind of chronicler. And of course we have his song on the soundtrack and so on. So I think one of the things that Peckinpah did was, rather than try to hide the fact that we have a celebrity like this in the movie, let's use it in some way that works, you know, that works for the movie. And you even have that, I think, too clever exchange, but you know, when Garrett gets back and he goes into the barber shop and he says, give me a shave, he's looking around the barber shop and he turns and looks back there and there's Dylan sitting at the table. And he says, who in the hell are you? And Dylan says, that's a good question, which of course always gets a big laugh, you know, thing. But that's how that character evolved. And Peckinpah himself said in an interview once that that was his intention. But you know, I've honestly never been able to really figure out whether he said that after he read my book, or because he had read it, because I know he had read the book at that time, or not. I never knew.
Well, it's kind of related, but about 6 weeks ago, took my grandchildren, son, to Freeport Sumner. We stopped at the Billy the Kid gravesite in the museum, and I had seen Bill O'Reilly's Legends and Lies on Billy the Kid. And the people that own the museum, the gravesite, absolutely said they always liked Bill O'Reilly and his that series of Legends and Lies, but that they felt that he did not do very good research on Billy the Kid, because it did not go at all with what the people before Sunday.
Well,
and they were just really adamant about
well,
that. And then somebody came in and they had to wait on me. We didn't finish the conversation, but I always stopped there. So
well, I've been there, and that's, you know, it's one of those things that it's called the official site of Billy the Kid. Yeah, the official site. But of course, you know that old Fort Sumner no longer exists. There were a series of floods. I don't think anybody honestly knows where that. Bob, do you know anything about that? I mean, is that grave site actually legitimate, or?
Well, We've got photographs of an old timer pointing to a spot, and just a field covered with all kinds of, I think and we don't know that they're buried together like that.
Yeah, I mean, it's just, this, again, it's like so much about this story. Did, a big source of controversy, did Billy have a gun with him the night he was killed? Nobody disputes the knife, but did he have the gun?
Well, Ms. Paul Harvey would say the rest of the story. I'm from Roswell, I'm really into Roswell.
Yeah.
But I had a book till I loaned it to somebody by Wilbur Coe, whom I knew, called Willington County War, and it was all about
Yeah.
And I wish I could get that book back. I didn't have it print. Maybe. Anyway, it's very interesting because I grew up in that area.
Yeah.
And knew it when I was a child, and Elizabeth Garrett and her Seydor dog were all over town. I mean, I remember her.
Yes.
I like what you're saying about Wild Bunch, because I think it's really fun. I think about Wild Bunch and say Ride the High Country, which are really tight narratives.
Yeah.
And I've seen Peck Air really good plenty of times, and I keep saying to myself, it just feels so fragmentary. You know,
Well,
relative to Peckinpah's other previous work. I'd like to just hear your comments about it.
Well, it's a very different film. It's a very different film from any he's made, and I think that's one of the things that's one of the problems. You know, what we critics and academics and fans and so forth do without problems, without issues. I mean, it does not have to be as slackly cut as parts of the preview are. That's where I think the theatrical version is an improvement. And that's the 2000, have you seen the 2005 special edition? Okay, and it is much better in that. But at the same time, he was not making a film like The Wild Bunch at this time. And this reflects a whole lot of things that were going on in his life and his personality at the time, which is one of the reasons why he identified so with Garrett. It's one of the reasons why Garrett is such a strong character in the film and Billy is such a relatively weak one in the film, because by then Peckinpah was so locked into Garrett, and Billy just becomes a kind of interject in his personality of something else. But I don't think the Billy the Kid character in the film is a particularly admirable character either, but there are many who do. I'll be with you in a moment, but the thing is that at that time, you know, Sam himself, his alcoholism was getting worse, okay? The sense that his powers were waning, that he was coming to the end of his association with the Western. I mean, somebody once said in a brilliant observation, every scene in the movie is a farewell scene. That is very nearly true. Every scene in the movie is either a farewell scene or a death scene. And death scenes are, of course, a kind of farewell scene, because that's where he was. That's where he was at that time until you get to the end of the film. I mean, I find the end of the film, in its own way, as powerful as the end of The Wild Bunch. Because the end of The Wild Bunch is finally affirmative. That is to say, new life grows out of the death. And you see the Wild Bunch apotheosized in legend and so forth. We see how bad men become legendary figures in the Wild Bunch. In Pat Garrett and Billy the Kid, there's nobody who's legendary at the end. I mean, they both die from ambush. I mean, it is perhaps the most completely, I don't want to say nihilistic, but it is the bleakest ending of all of his films. I mean, and the last shot, depending on which version of the film ending you like, but the one I prefer is the last shot, which is the one from the original script too, of Garrett just rides out and disappears into the desert. And all of you, how many of you have seen the film? All of you do recognize the allusion to Shane at the end of the film, don't you? Yes. As far as I know, I was the first one to point that out, at least in writing, where instead of "come back, Shane, come back," the boy's picking up stones and throwing them at his horse. Get out of here, you've destroyed everything. And so that, I think, accounts for the differences. I mean, it is meant to be more ruminative, you know, it's meant to be a darker film. It certainly doesn't have all that, it doesn't have the excitement and the exhilaration. I mean, I think you see horses at the gallop only once, and that's when they ride up on Silvis when he was killed. That's it. Otherwise, everything moves slow. Everything. I mean, you know what Henry James used to say: you must grant the artist his subject. I mean, I can understand if this is not the kind of movie you want to see, but to me, that doesn't invalidate the film. That just means that, you know, it's not your taste. Yes.
Could you tell us about why Peckinpah left during the making of the film?
Oh God, that thing. In a nutshell, okay, in a nutshell, I think it is because he began to lose faith in the film. There were certain intractable problems with the film. The biggest one was the whole trip to Mexico and turning back from Mexico. Because in the book, of course, as in Nider's, or in Nider's book and in the screenplay, the kid does go to Mexico. Why does he go to Mexico? It's completely unclear in the movie. He says, you guys all better get out of here because there's going to be some hard times coming down, which seems so odd to me, because then it feels like he's deserting them all. And then one of them says, well, you know, we'd sure like to go with you. And I think to myself, why the hell don't you go with them? What's keeping you here in Fort Sumner? They're just sitting around drinking and trading women and all the rest. I mean, what is keeping them that we don't? Now, in actuality, some of these men had families, but Peckinpah doesn't show any of that. That's not part of the thing. The film, that was very, very tricky. He did some hasty patch jobs in the looping, where he tried to make it seem as if it's vengeance because Silvis is killed, Paco is killed. In Nider's novel, which is set in Northern California, they do go to Mexico. They have to go to Mexico because everybody is after them. But then he just goes down to Mexico and he can't stand it there. He's got a girlfriend. He does have a girlfriend up there, and they have a very tortuous relationship. Plus, he just can't tear himself away from needling Garrett. Plus, he hates Mexico, and he loves Northern California. This is all really, really well done in the novel. In Wurlitzer's original screenplay, it's much, much better. He does go to Mexico, and all he does is he indulges in this bender. He just drinks himself to stupefaction in Mexico until he finally winds up going into some cabin that is completely empty. He falls asleep, and when he wakes up, there's somebody in the bunk bed of the cabin. He falls asleep at the table. This gaunt guy with staring eyes, we don't know if he's alive or dead. And Billy takes one look at that and goes back to Fort Sumner.
So you're saying Peckinpah was frustrated at how to deal with all of these elements?
Yes, and he was not above at times in his career saying, okay, they took it away from me, there's nothing I can do about it. And how do we know this? Well, a year later, Dan Melnick said, come back. Cut the film any way you want it. Bring in the editor of your choice. You can have the full facilities of the studio. Make the movie that you want to make. And as Garth Craven, the editor, one of the two principal editors on Peckinpah, I said, Garth, what happened? And he said, well, it occupied Sam's attention for about 15 minutes. And then he lost interest in it, as he did so many things. I mean, one of them was, no doubt, going on to make another movie because, as Garth Simmons once put it, Sam was a basket case everywhere except on a movie set. But if he really wanted to do it, he could have easily found editors who could have done it under his supervision.
But
now, I think what happened was, as he saw the critical literature, I mean, it got almost universally bad reviews from the first round of critics, except for Jay Cox in Time magazine. Immediately, it disappears from theaters, and the little magazine starts taking it out. And it is proclaimed one of his masterpieces, and its reputation went nowhere but up since. And as that happened year after year, then he began to show the preview version. The only trouble with the preview version is, which so many people love because it's longer, the preview version is missing 2 key scenes. It doesn't have the wife scene in it, and it doesn't have the Ruthie Lee scene in it. Without either of those scenes, the prostitutes montage looks like a softcore porn scene. You put either one of those scenes back in it, it has a place. So I'm a little baffled by these people who have this unaccountable allegiance to the previews. It does let us see the frame story, and that's important. And it does let us see the Chisholm story, but I put all of that back into the special edition.
So we just got into all the editing, but when it goes back to the actual making of the film, you're saying he left, he just was frustrated and...
What happened was, he knew that he had 2 previews, neither of which he attended, by the way. But he knew as soon as the 2 previews were done, by contract, that's all the studio had to give them. And they were up against the wall. And he absolutely refused to do any more work on the film. And so Roger Spotswood, the principal editor, Garth left with Sam. Roger Spotswood, the principal editor, and Bob Wolf, who they had brought on, faced a choice. The studio says, you can shorten it or we'll shorten it. Sam never forgave Roger for doing it. I think he was as wrong could be, because they did a beautiful job with it. And they did a marvelous film, but that's how it happened. I hate to say it because this is a man who I think was a genius and somebody I profoundly admire, and I think The Wild Bunch is one of the great artworks of the last century, and I think he was one of the great filmmakers. But like a lot of the great filmmakers, and there are more than you might, he could do this kind of stuff. You know, he could just walk away from this kind of stuff. Like John Ford walked away from The Horse Soldiers, which I think was a real good film. You know, there's a lot of this, there's more of this that goes on in your mind. Yes, sir?
You had started to talk about the controversy over whether Billy had a gun the night he was killed, and you didn't get through that. I'd like to hear
Well, God, I talk about it a lot in the book. There is so much to get through. I mean, here's the thing. Some people who came in immediately after he was killed didn't see a gun beside him. Others said there was a knife in one hand, he did have a knife, a gun in the other hand, okay, or beside him with a gun. Mark Gardner says, well, you got to keep in mind, one of the first persons back in the room was Garrett. He picked up the gun to see if it was fired. Once he did that, he wouldn't have put the gun back down on the ground. He probably would have put it someplace else. At least 2 of the people who were sympathetic to Billy, who said there was no gun, contradicted themselves later. Okay? I found, Mark Gardner sent me a fascinating news story about a guy who bought what was left of Pete Maxwell's house after the flooding, and he rebuilt the bedroom, and there were the window casings was there, and he found a bullet in one of the window casings, and that's thought to be the bullet that Billy fired. They don't know if his gun fired or not, but other people who were there said no, his gun never cleared the holster. What I find interesting about that particular controversy is whether you say he fired the gun or it never cleared the holster, both of those accounts place the gun in his hand. All right? Furthermore, I don't know why Garrett, I mean, why would Garrett, when Garrett picked up the gun and examined it, okay, he said, I can't tell if it was fired or not. There's an empty chamber in there. That indicates it might have been fired, but that doesn't mean anything because lots of us keep an empty chamber there as a safety measure. Now, if he had really wanted to lie, why didn't he just say, yeah, it proves the gun was fired, it was fired? I don't think anybody would have checked and it was gone down. I mean, so what I mostly see from Garrett's book is that I see he's trying to tell the truth to the best of his ability. I mean, he never, ever presented his killing of Billy as anything other than basically an ambush. And when people said he was a coward for doing it, at the end of the book, he says, "Was I scared?" He says, "Hell yes, I was scared." I mean, he said he wasn't going to be taken alive. If he had seen me first, I would have been the one who was killed. I mean, when he killed Charlie Beaudry, you know, once again, he didn't make it seem as if he did. He said when he showed his head, they thought it was the kid, not Beaudry, because of the hat. They opened fire and shot him. Interestingly enough, he didn't even include the detail that one of his deputies did. I mean, one of his deputies, remembering the episode, said that Garrett told him to drop his gun, and Beaudry didn't, and so that's when they opened fire. Now, I don't know why Garrett didn't put that in his book, but I can't see that Garrett ever tries to make himself look as if he's more heroic, braver, etc., and so forth than anybody else. On the contrary, he says, "Look, I'm doing my job, and yeah, if it's him or me, it's going to be him. It's not going to be me. And don't give me anything about a fair fight." Because we know, of course, that Billy himself never fought fair. Well, but you didn't in those days. I mean, the idea was, read Nider's book or read any of the histories. You know, as somebody once chided me for a statement I made about, one of the things about Peckinpah's film that's so extraordinary is that it shows sometimes how senseless or how quick people resort to violence. People resorted to violence in those days. And the more I read about Lincoln County, it was the murder capital of the world. I had 47 times the homicide rate, and as Fred Nolan put it, why? I wish they'd keep this in mind. I'm about to put my foot in it, I know, but I wish they'd keep this in mind in places like Florida, Texas, et al., with concealed carry and everything else. A lot of guns and a lot of booze equals a lot of killing and death. Okay? Yes, not to mention drugs. Okay? In the Old West, they had it right. You checked your guns. Especially if you were a cowboy coming in off the ride, you're going to want to get drunk. You're probably going to want to get laid. You're probably going to want to gamble. Do it, live and be well, have a great time, but your guns stay here. There's a wonderful story that's told about Billy the Kid. This is where I'll end it. When he and his pals went to one of the dances, and you were supposed to check your guns at the door. And they presumably did check their guns at the door. Except at one point in the evening, Billy and a buddy decide they're going to go out and race. And they go out and they have a race and they run toward the dance hall. And Billy, when he ran inside, he apparently tripped or something and just fell splayed on the floor like that. And quicker than you can imagine, his buddies were surrounding him with their guns drawn. Nobody knew where they got their guns, but he said, but the man who ran the dance said, and it was a good friend of Billy's, "You're banned. Never again. Don't come back." I think they were more enlightened than we were.
Thank you.
My pleasure.